You all know my great disdain for chemistry. It is pointless and nothing good has ever come from it. But I do enjoy my bit of physics. And I'm going to cheat and erase this part because I think it's the most obvious. What Boyle's law actually says is obviously that there is a direct correlation between pressure and volume. Technically, his law is volume 1, pressure 1 equals volume 2, pressure 2. But basically what it works down to is that volume is equal to the inverse of the pressure. So, if we doubled the volume of a space, what would we do to the pressure in that space? Yeah, we'd cut it in half. If we dropped the volume by a third, what would we do to the pressure? Increase it by 3, exactly. All right, and that's basically all it says. Boyle's law is that basically the relationship between a pressure and a volume of gas is always inversely proportional. Like I said, his more complicated law is P1 V1 equals P2 V2 when we're talking about pressure and volumes. But as I mentioned, we can simplify this for our purposes that volume is inversely proportional to pressure. Right. When one doubles, the other halves. When one triples, the other drops by a third, and so on and so forth.
Can you go back one?
Yep.
No. Yeah, keep it.
All right. And again, the example I always like to give for this when we're talking about these things is how, again, pressure is the force of things on their environment. So if you were a gas inside this room, and I blindfolded all of you and I let you roam around aimlessly, then what would happen is I would count the number of times you bounced against a wall or somebody bounced against a wall, and that would be the pressure in this room. If I then took all of you and stuck you into the closet where we have the cadavers, right, I've dramatically dropped the space that is in there, so what's going to happen to the number of times you guys bounce into the walls?
Increases.
Right, so the volume goes down, pressure goes up. If instead I let you roam around campus and count the number of times you bounce into the boundaries of the campus with a lot more space, what's going to happen to the number of times you guys bounce into the walls? Decrease, exactly. So when the volume goes down, the pressure increases. When the volume goes up, the pressure decreases. Right? It's basically the number of times you guys are bouncing on the wall, and if you change the volume, you change the pressure, and it is proportional. Not really any new information. All we've really done is, I guess, confirm that it is inversely proportional, one-to-one relationship, and we've given it a fancy name because good old Bob Boyle was the first one to describe this law. All right? Questions on that? Yes? I'm sorry? Again, it's metric. When we're talking about the lungs, we're going to be metric, or cubic millimeters, something like that. So yeah, the units aren't as important. All right. What is important is that these pressure changes cause a movement of air. Right? And that's the key. As we've talked about, Boyle's law, changing volume, changing the pressure, is going to determine how the air moves. And it will use the active contraction and the passive relaxation of the muscles for that to occur. However, if we're not going to use ATP, we have to rely on other concepts. One is surface tension. As we'll talk about in just a minute, we already mentioned how surface tension is a bad thing inside of the alveoli. In fact, the alveoli have those special cells. What were the cells inside the alveoli that helped with surface tension? Septal cells, the type 2 pneumocytes. That produced what? Surfactant, to break up the surface tension inside the alveoli. However, outside the lungs, Between the lungs and the thoracic cavity, surface tension is our friend. We want the lungs to be in contact with the thoracic cavity. Because after all, when we are expanding the thoracic cavity, we want the lungs to expand with it. So by maintaining a negative pressure in there, and by maintaining surface tension, where the wall of the ribs move, the lungs will move with it. So surface tension there is absolutely a good thing. Especially for a passive exhale, the compliance of the lungs, their elasticity and their ability to recoil back to their normal shape is vital. As we talked about before, right, Grandpa, who worked in the coal mine for 20 years and smoked 2 packs of cigarettes for 30 years and had all these other issues, his lungs have lost some of that elasticity even just from age as well. So now to get his lungs back to their shape, he now has to actively contract muscles, making both exhalation and inhalation a active process. And now you're basically using twice as much ATP just to sit there and breathe. So the elasticity, the flexibility of the thoracic cavity, and obviously the surficant in the alveoli to maintain them staying open. All of these things are vital, right? And these are things that change during the course of our lives, right? So one of the things we'll talk about later today when we get to the respiratory volumes, I'm going to give you what the average adult male volume actually is for these, what the actual number is. Is that a number you necessarily need to memorize? No, because it's going to vary dramatically from people, from person to person, and from person to different parts of their ages, absolutely. However, what you're absolutely positively going to need to know is the definitions and how to calculate those values, so that I can give you any random numbers and you could give me other ones. But we'll work our way up to that. All right? Now, to get the air to move, as we talked about, we need to change the volume and change the pressures. But we need to identify what these pressures are to really understand this. All right, so I need the board. Any questions on this before I erase it? All right, excellent. How do I want to do this? I want that. So I'll do this over here. All right. That'll work. All right. So, as we've mentioned, and as you can clearly see, this is the lung. This is the thoracic cavity. This would be then the pleural cavity. Let's say wall of. This is obviously outside. And this is clearly not drawn to scale, an alveolus. All right? That basic anatomy makes sense now? All right. Obviously, everything that we talk about when we talk about our pressures are going to be related to atmospheric pressure. Anyone know what atmospheric pressure is? Yeah, it's going to be 760 millimeters of mercury. Our unit is millimeters of mercury. What does that actually mean? I don't actually know what it means either. No, I'm just kidding. Basically, mercury is a liquid metal. And the pressures are related to how far they can push that droplet of mercury. So basically, atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury. Obviously, you can push that drop of mercury really, really far, right? And you don't think about how much pressure there is on your body at all until you're watching these YouTube videos where someone, right, puts themselves up against the wall and sucks the pressure out from a bag that they're surrounded in, and just the pressure from the atmosphere in their environment keeps them up against the wall, right? So we've got this massive force of the air that is pushing down on us, and that's huge because it condenses the air around us so that when we take in a breath of air, we get a large amount of oxygen. You haven't thought of it in those ways, but you absolutely know that because of that heavy pressure on the air and that condensing of the air, so that when you take a breath, you get a large amount of oxygen. You have no problem carrying your 3 bags of groceries up the 2 flights of stairs to get to your apartment. However, when you go up to Tahoe for the weekend, it's at a much higher elevation with a lot smaller atmospheric pressure, so the air expands out, and when you take a breath of air in, it doesn't have nearly as much oxygen in it. So you get exhausted just walking up those 6 flights of stairs to get inside of the casino. All right? That's why you have that difference, is because of that pressure of the air. All right? Obviously, it's known as 1 atmosphere. Atmosphere is a measure of pressure, but that's meaningless for us. So we'll stick with the 760 millimeters of mercury. All right? There are 3 other pressures, though, that we need to focus on. And when we talk about these other pressures, any pressure that is less than atmospheric pressure, we consider a negative respiratory pressure. Any pressure that is greater than atmospheric pressure, we consider it to be a positive respiratory pressure. So everything is related to atmospheric pressure, and of course this 760 millimeters of mercury is at sea level, which is close enough to where we are right now. All right. If you don't like my drawing, here's a pretty picture from your textbook that kind of shows the exact same thing. We have our atmospheric pressure out here in the outside world. We have our bronchi leading down to our alveoli inside of our lungs. We have our pleural cavity contained within the wall of our thoracic cavity. And the first pressure we're going to talk about is going to be the pressure inside of the alveolus. This is what is known as the intrapulmonary pressure. Or P. Pul. This is the pressure within the alveolus. And with our intrapulmonary pressure, let's do it this way. Pressure in alveoli. There are 2 keys to the intrapulmonary pressure. It can be positive or negative. Which means what? Yeah, it means it can be higher than 760, be a positive pressure, but it also can be lower than 760. It can be a negative pressure. However, the second key to the intrapulmonary pressure is it will always equalize to the atmospheric pressure. Make sense? Yes. We'll go through a cycle, but the key is, as we talked about, it can go above atmospheric pressure, but it's always going to come back down. It can go below, but it's always going to come back up. So no matter how we change it, it is always going to equalize back to atmospheric pressure. And we'll see that when we take our respiratory cycle, right? When we take a breathing cycle. All right. The second pressure we need to add is the intrapleural pressure. The intrapleural pressure, or PIP, is the pressure in the pleural cavity, between the lungs and the walls of the thoracic cavity. And there are two rules for this as well. It must always be negative. So it must always be below atmospheric pressure. And it can not equal our intrapleural pressure.
Intrapulmonary pressure?
Sorry, intrapulmonary pressure. Sorry. Yeah. Cannot equal the intrapulmonary pressure. I at least wrote it right. What would happen if these two pressures became equal to each other? Yeah. When you then went to try to inflate your lungs by expanding your thoracic cavity, the lungs wouldn't move with it. What do we call that condition? No, well, it can lead to death. But what do we call the condition where the pressures aren't proper, where either this becomes a positive pressure, or this becomes equal to the intrapulmonary pressure? No, not
Asthma?
You're overthinking this. Collapse. It's a collapsed lung, exactly. That's when people say your lung has collapsed, right? It isn't so much that it's gone flat like a pancake. What that means is that when you're moving your thoracic cavity, the lung won't expand with it. So it stays collapsed down and isn't able to expand, right? So you have a collapsed lung. Luckily, as we've talked about, both lungs are individually shrink wrapped. So if this lung's pleural cavity becomes compromised, hopefully the other one is still okay and can continue to expand and keep you alive until they resolve whatever's wrong with this one. All right? Questions on that? Yes? Typically what you'll do, what usually is happening is like some kind of blood or air has gotten into that space. So what they'll do is they'll put a hose in there, suck out whatever is in there, the air, the fluid and all that, and then seal it. And so in that case, you reestablish that negative pressure in there. You get whatever fluid was putting force on the lungs, increasing the pressure. You try to pull that out or pull the air out, making that an empty and negative environment again, and now your lung is able to expand. All right? The last pressure, it's the one kind of we just talked about. I'm not even going to bother writing it up here on the board. But basically, it is the difference between these two pressures. Our transpulmonary pressure is basically the difference between the pressure inside of the lungs and the pressure inside of the cavity. And like I said, this should always be a positive number. Notice I said number there, not positive pressure. Right? Notice using the numbers that they've given us here, and we'll talk about these numbers, that difference is 4. Clearly, 4 millimeters of mercury pressure is far, far below 760. So it must be a positive number. If it's not a positive number, that means the intrapleural pressure is greater than the intrapulmonary pressure, and like I said, that means it's collapsing the lung. All right? Questions on these? This makes sense, then the rest of this will go smoothly. Keeps airways open, we did that. All right. So, as I've mentioned, as we put up here on the rules, when we're talking about the intrapulmonary pressure, it is going to fluctuate as we take a breath, can actually become positive and negative, but it is always going to equalize to atmospheric pressure, and our intrapleural pressure always has to be less than both the atmospheric and the intrapulmonary pressure. So let's actually look at the pressure changes when we take a single breath. So here we'll put pressure on our graph, and then obviously down here is time. And of course, we always need to have some kind of reference point on our axis, and in this case, it will be our atmospheric pressure, which again is 760 millimeters of mercury. A breathing cycle involves 2 phases. What are the 2 phases of a breathing cycle? Inhalation and exhalation. Excellent. So let's draw. And over here, we'll have the inhalation. And over here, we'll have the exhalation. Excellent. Alrighty. And what we need is a starting point. Of course, our respiration is a cycle, which means what?
Does it have a start and stop?
Yeah, it's a continuous process. Doesn't really have a start and a stop. It's a continuous process that goes round and round and round. But we can talk about a common starting point, and that can be before you take that first inhalation. So before you take that first inhalation, your intrapulmonary pressure, which is blue, is equal to atmospheric pressure. And our intrapulmonary pressure, intrapleural, is negative, less than both of them. So this is our starting point. So, you start to take an inhalation. Describe to me the mechanical processes that are taking place.
Diaphragm is contracting.
All right, we'll start with the resting tidal breath. Your diaphragm is contracting. And when your diaphragm contracts, what happens to the volume of our thoracic cavity?
Increases.
It increases. And since our lungs have that compliance, our lungs have that negative pressure, they expand with it. So where our ribs go, our lungs go with it. So when our diaphragm contracts, essentially what happens is our thoracic cavity and our lungs expand And as we've talked about, the volume increases and our pressure decreases. Now let's do this right. Volume of the lungs increases, so the pressure in our lungs does what?
Decrease.
Decreases. And our pressure becomes negative, as we said it could. Now, again, our thoracic cavity is expanding, and our lungs are expanding with it, right? When they're at rest, they're really close together. And as our lungs start to expand, because of the negative pressure inside of it, because of surface tension between the transudate on the two layers, in this case transudate's a good thing, causing that surface tension, when our ribs expand, our lungs are going to expand with it. However, do you think it's going to maintain the same spacing? There might be a little bit more space as we're stretching it out. So what's going to happen to the volume of our pleural cavity as we take that inhalation? Volume of the pleural cavity increases. And when the volume of the pleural cavity increases, what happens to the pressure inside the pleural cavity? Excellent. And so our intrapleural pressure is also going to decrease.
So are they going at the same rate to maintain that -4?
Not necessarily. Yeah. Notice I purposely haven't put numbers here. However, notice I'm only halfway through my inhalation. Because while my lungs are expanding, my thoracic cavity is expanding, my lungs, thanks to my trachea and my larynx and my pharynx and my nasal cavity, is open to the outside world. So notice what happens is we produce a pressure gradient. Now our atmospheric pressure is now greater than the pressure inside of the lungs. And just like solutes like a concentration gradient, gases like a pressure gradient. And what do they like to do on pressure gradients? From high to low, they go down. So now that there's a pressure gradient, what's going to happen? Air is going to move into lungs. All right? I expand the size of this room. And now the pressure in here is less than it is in the outside world. And our pressure dropped. But because that door is open, and there are a bunch of kids outside in a higher pressure environment, a bunch of students are going to rush into this room. And as we add more students to this room, what's going to happen to the number of times somebody bounces against the wall? Increases. This flow of air into the lungs increases the pressure in the lungs. and it's going to increase the pressure until what happens? Equilibrium. Right? What's equilibrium?
760 millimeters per.
Yeah, when they are equal to each other, and that's exactly what's going to happen. That's cheap. Right? Air enters, air increases the pressure until pressure in the lungs is equal to the pressure of the atmosphere. Alright, so remember we were talking earlier about how it's always going to equalize back to atmospheric pressure? This is why, because it's always open to the outside world, we're always going to seek equilibrium, right? If you take the largest inhalation you can until you stop, right? Does that mean there's no more room in your lungs? No. If I forced an air hose into you, do you think I could get more air into you? Yeah, absolutely. What's happened is you've changed the shape and air has moved in until the volume, the pressures outside here in the world and inside here in your lungs become equal. So you expand and the pressure drops, then a bunch more air comes in until the pressure equalizes again. All right? Notice here, it's not that we're changing the volume or anything, we are adding air. We're adding more students to this room. And when we add more students to the room, more things bounce against the wall. All right? Questions on that? But what about the pleural cavity? Does air from the outside world rush into that?
No.
No. So is its pressure going to go back up? No. As long as you have those muscles contracted, your intrapleural pressure is going to stay low, which is clearly much more than 4 now. So that's why I purposely didn't put those numbers, because we're not going to worry about having to calculate it step by step. But it definitely changes during that inhalation.
So as long as the muscles are contracted was the key.
It's going to stay up, exactly. Because no air can enter into that, so again, we've decreased the intrapleural pressure because we've expanded the volume. All right. Questions on that? Once you take that inhalation, do you just hold it in forever?
No.
No. Eventually you let that air out. Right? Exhalation is where your diaphragm relaxes. The immediate effect of that is the thoracic cavity. I'm going to cheat, write it down here. No, that's not going to work either. All right, I'm going to have to squeeze it in the top. Our thoracic cavity, let's say it this way, recoils. Right? When it recoils, right, thoracic cavity recoils, our lungs recoil thanks to the compliance of them. What happens to the volume of our lungs then? Decreases. So the volume of the lungs decreases. And when the volume of the lungs decrease, what happens to the pressure in the lungs? Pressure increases. So our intrapleural pressure increases. But now, once again, we have a pressure gradient. Now, the pressure in the lungs is greater than the pressure in the outside world. And so what happens?
Pressure goes up.
So the pressure has gone up. There's now pressure is greater inside this room than outside. So it's going to happen.
Air's gonna leave.
Air is going to leave. Excellent. Air exits the lungs. And when we have our air exiting the lungs, what's going to happen? Pressure is going to go down. Until the lungs are completely empty?
No.
No, until what point?
Equilibrium.
Equilibrium. Excellent. Air is going to exit the lungs until the pressure in the lungs is equal to the pressure of the atmosphere. Of course, here in our intrapleural pressure, in the volume, when we relax the muscle and the lungs recoil, the volume of the pleural cavity is going to decrease. And what effect is that going to have on the pressure?
Increase.
Increases the intrapleural pressure. So we'll start to see a curve that looks a little something like this. Does air then move in or out, continuing to change the intrapleural cavity's pressure?
No.
No. So it is going to just stay at that point, and notice now we are right back where we started. Intrapleural pulmonary pressure is equal to atmospheric pressure, and our intrapleural pressure is negative. And if you don't like my drawings, here's the pretty picture from the textbook that shows the exact same thing. Notice here, we see the movement of air. So while you take that normal resting breath and about a half a liter of air comes into and out of your lungs, it comes in because we expand the thoracic cavity and the pressure inside our lungs drops. So air flows in to fill that space and it brings it back equal to atmospheric pressure. We then constrict our lungs, either by just relaxing it or mechanically. That lowers the volume, which increases the pressure, and then the air is able to then leave, and it continues to leave until it reaches atmospheric pressure again. So as we said at the beginning, notice our intrapulmonary pressure can be negative or can be positive, but it is always going to equalize to atmospheric pressure. Our intrapleural pressure is also going to decrease and increase as we inhale and exhale, but we don't get the complicated curve here because no air should be entering into this space. So when the volume of the thoracic cavity increases, its pressure decreases. When the volume of the thoracic cavity decreases, its pressure increases. And again, I purposely have not put numbers on here, but notice, when we're talking about sitting here and taking a normal resting tidal breaths, notice we're talking about basically less than a 2 millimeter of mercury change. So these are nice, small, shallow breaths. It's only moving about half a liter of air into and out of your lungs. All right? Yes?
There's no air entering the pleural cavity. Why are there pressure changes?
Because the volume is still expanding, right? As the thoracic cavity is expanding, the lungs have that surface tension. There's that negative pressure that's going to cause the lungs to expand as well. That's why the lungs go along with it. However, you're still increasing the volume, and so the space around the lungs is still going to get bigger. And when that volume gets bigger, its pressure goes down. And then when it recoils, that volume around the lungs gets smaller, and so its pressure goes up. So we're still changing the size of it, and so that change in size is still going to cause a change in pressure. It's just no air moves in and out, so we don't have that second portion of the wave that we see with the intrapleural. All right? Yes?
So when we're relaxing the diaphragm, you said this will cause exhalation and that the volume will decrease in the thoracic cavity
Mm-hmm.
and pressure of the thoracic cavity will go up or the
Yeah,
whole
both.
direction?
Well, again, what happens to the thoracic cavity happens to the lungs. The lungs don't have muscle in them, right? There's no skeletal muscle. We don't contract and relax the lungs. As I mentioned, the reason the lungs move, and let's emphasize this again. All right, let's pretend we had a square lung, because it's convenient that way. As we know, this lung is surrounded by a visceral pleura. The wall of the thoracic cavity is lined with a parietal pleura. All right. As we've already seen, in between them is our pleural cavity. And it has a negative pressure. Meaning that the pressure here inside the lungs is greater than the pressure here. So the pressure expands, pushing out. Kind of like when you have that bag of chips in the back of your car and you drive up to Tahoe for the weekend, right? It fills up because the pressure inside is greater than the pressure outside, so it's pushing the lungs against the wall of the thoracic cavity. We also have that thin layer of transudate lining the visceral and parietal pleuras, right, which is mostly water. And as we've talked about, like when you were trying to lift that glass of lemonade off of your glass patio, right, the water from those two surfaces has surface tension. So in between here we have surface tension. So when our thoracic cavity expands, right, because the surface tension between the two surfaces, because of the negative pressures in there, the lungs should expand with it. Right? That's how we expand the lungs. It's the negative pressure and it is the surface tension, so that when we expand our thoracic cavity, the lungs expand out with it.
So what pressure goes up?
I'm sorry?
What of the pressure goes up?
So when you're expanding, the volume of both the thoracic cavity and the volume of the lungs are going up. So the pressure in here goes down, right? The volume of both of these, volume of the thoracic cavity increases, volume of the lungs increase. And that causes, obviously, the pressure to drop. But notice also, even though the distance has pretty much stayed the same, isn't there also an increase in the volume of the pleural cavity? Yeah, so notice also here, the volume has also increased, and so here the pressure has also decreased. So notice, when we take that inhalation, both pressures at first drop. However, the difference between these two cavities is that the lungs are open to the outside world, where there's always that atmospheric pressure. And when the pressure in here drops below atmospheric pressure, air comes in. And when you add more air to bounce against the walls, that brings the pressure back up until the two are equal. Notice no air can get into the pleural cavity, so as a result of that, its pressure stays down until we recoil it, and then the opposite. When the thoracic cavity decreases back to its original size, the lungs recoil back to its original size as well. Volume decreases, pressure increases in both. However, when we increase the pressure here, air is able to leave until it becomes equal. Okay? So yeah, so what we do to the thoracic cavity happens to the lungs because of that negative intrapleural pressure and because of the surface tension from the transudate on the visceral and the parietal pleura. All right, I apologize if I didn't make that more clear earlier. All right? Questions on this? All right, this is a good place for our first break. Let's go ahead and take our first